Good afternoon. Very warm welcome from the Center for European Studies in Harvard, mainly with its European antennas today, Madrid and Athens. It's a great pleasure for us to have Joaquin Almunia and Miranda Xafa to discuss about the Greek adjustment program as it was implemented by the European Stability Mechanism. But let me introduce the topic a little bit before I go into this impressive CVs of our two participants. Greece has been right at the top of our agenda since 2010, actually. We had numerous debates at the Center for European Studies, and the little format which we are now using today, the European Economic Policy Forum, to discuss Greek issues. Greece has been very interesting for many reasons. First, because it somehow institutionalized issues which were not perceived as being acceptable. For example, the European Stability Fund, which was created on the fly in 2010, was deemed to be never ever part of the game. And in particular, the institution which is now charged and tasked Joaquin Almunia to evaluate the program, the European Stability Mechanism, was not seen as one institution you would like to have. It would, because having it would mean creating moral hazard, creating incentives to misbehave. But then it got launched and it was deeply involved in the Greek adjustment program. Assessing what has been happening there is important for programs going forward. So the really useful report which has been produced by Joaquin Almunia and his collaborators is in particular interesting if you think about what is going to happen afterwards with other cases. ESM now being an established institution serving its purpose. Should it be adjusted? Should it be Europeanized, still being an intergovernmental institution under actually private law, Luxembourg? So many issues going forward. But first of all, taking stock is crucial. And that's why I do think this debate today should be interesting. And I would really encourage you to come in and to use the Q&A session, which is half of our time, to discuss issues. So first, let me introduce our main speaker. Joaquin Almunia is known for many reasons. In Germany, he is, for example, known for having reorganized a part of our banking system. When he was commissioner for competition, he was actually in charge of running, during the crisis, the reorganizing, the restructuring of banking systems all over Europe. Before that, he was in charge of economics and financial affairs, also at the EU Commission. But he's mainly a person, as I know him, who is driven by norms, evidence-based, a real policymaker, so also drilling deep into the issues. And that really shows in this report. Miranda Xafa, whom I do not really know personally, so I shouldn't pretend to know too much about her, which forced me, quote unquote, to read about what she's written. I knew her competence in restructuring issues, in issues about debt, where she published a number of very useful papers, but I didn't know that she was also so much involved in policy making. And this is now actually, of course, not analytics theory. It's about applying tools to serve a public purpose. Without further ado, Joaquin, I give it over to you.
Thank you very much, Helmut, and thank you very much, of course, to the Center for European Studies at Harvard University and to the people working there, in particular Basilis, who help us a lot to organize this discussion. So I want to, I would like to look at my PowerPoint presentation if someone can connect me to the, yeah, okay. Here we are. I have here my presentation. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So this evaluation report from the ESM chairman of the Board of Governors, Mario Centeno, who is in the picture. At that time, last year, in February last year, was the chairman of the Governor's Board of the ESM, and also Minister of Finance of Portugal and chairman of the Eurogroup. And he asked me to be the evaluator of what has happened in Greece with the financial assistance provided by EU resources from 2012 till 2019, till the third quarter of 2019. And the other person in the picture is Klaus Regling, the managing director of the ESM. We worked together at the Commission when I was in charge of economic and monetary affairs. He was the director general of ECFIN, and he has been extremely supportive of the evaluation work and extremely respectful of my independence as evaluator. The mandate I received is to evaluate how the financial assistance to Greece support informed decision-making going forward, how to increase transparency and hence accountability of those who were providing the resources and those who were receiving the resources, to enhance ability to tackle future crises, not only Greek crisis, but in any other Euro area country in the future, and applying international evaluation criteria. I don't have time to explain to all of you how I worked, but I only say that I had a fantastic team allocated by Klaus Regling with some ESM employees, but also with some external people that helped me to write and to prepare all the work behind this report. If we can go to the next slide. Yeah, just how we started the work in March 2019. I, with the support of the team, we define what were the problems. It was not difficult to do it. The threat of loss of market access for Greece, the risks of the forced exit of Greece from the Euro area, and we needed to support the Euro area integrity, and the fear that the problems, economic problems in Greece, will have negative spillovers in other Euro area countries. The strategic objectives that we found in the agreements adopted by the member states deciding this financial support were to preserve Euro area integrity and stability, to restore financial stability in Greece as one of the necessary conditions to ensure this stability, and to achieve in Greece sustainable inclusive growth. This was developed through different strategies to prioritize deficit and debt reduction, to improve productivity, competitiveness, and long-term growth in the Greek economy, to restore confidence both of internal economic agents and consumers in Greece and of external potential investors, to recapitalize the banking sector, to minimize contagion, in particular through a new instrument that was created in 2012, the private sector involvement, the PSI, to strengthen institutions and their independence, to restore debt sustainability going forward, not only during the Greek programs, but beyond the end of the Greek support programs, and to establish an ample cash buffers as a primary exit strategy of these programs. Next, please. So the work was carried out since March 2019 till June 2020. So we concluded with the discussion at the Board of Governors of the ESM. I presented the conclusions and the recommendations. after the evaluation, and the members of the board of the ESM just took note and adopted some other decisions for the follow-up. The report has conclusions at the end, a chapter of conclusions, and I will point out the conclusions that I think are more relevant for a discussion such as the one we will have today. For the contribution of the Greek programs to Euro area financial stability, that was a positive contribution. This was a success of the programs. The financial stability at the Euro area level was preserved and protected. The integrity of the Euro area indeed was kept. And in Greece also, there were important positive results. But looking at the Euro area, not only this Euro area financial stability was achieved and preserved, but also the discussions around the Greek programs helped the Euro area for an evolving recognition of the economic and monetary union design flows. The creation of the ESM in 2012 is one of these recognitions that the Euro area had not at the beginning in the original design these kind of instruments to provide support for countries in difficulties, and the risks of the Euro area integrity that emerged in 2010 when the public debt explosion was considered a very important problem for Greece and for the whole Euro area. The discussions about the maintenance of Greece in the Euro area were there in 2010, in 2012, and at the end, in the first half of 2015, when the Tsipras government took office, this discussion was strong. But thanks to the decisions adopted at this moment in 2015, the second part of 2015, and in the years after, the tensions were less pronounced. And today, in my view, there are no risks for the integrity of the Euro area, not only because of the decisions adopted with Greece, not only because of the creation of the ESM, but also because of the advances in the creation of a banking union, even if it's not yet completed, and other decisions that have been adopted in the last years. By no means the last decisions during the pandemic, the EU Next Generation instrument would be also extremely important to reinforce the integrity of the Euro area. Next, please. The second group of conclusions look at the effects of the program on the Greek economy and society. Those effects were also clearly positive, but if you read the report, you will find a lot of comments and analysis saying, well, this objective, this target was achieved, but not yet completed, is in the making, we need more time to fully assess the real effects of the help provided to Greece through those programs. Some conclusions, because of this not fully consistent positive achievements, because product market reforms that were one of the conditions sent to the Greek authorities failed to complement labor market reforms that were better completed or developed, and the measures for the financial sector restored confidence and financial stability in Greece, but have not yet laid foundations for medium-term growth. These conclusions were written down in 2019. So we are not taking into account when presenting these conclusions what has happened during the months of the pandemic. I will refer to this at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Third group of conclusions, the analysis of the program strategy for sustainable and inclusive growth. Sustainability has been one of the main concerns of my evaluation and the analysis of the report. To be sustainable, the growth needs to be inclusive. And during the first programs since 2010 till the third program, the ESM program that started really the second part of 2015, the relevant social measures were set up as objectives but not effectively implemented. Only during the ESM program, so during the last 3 years of the programs, the social measures started to become effective. But in the long run, potential challenges remain in the ESM framework for post-program engagement due to the fact that the ESM is the long-term creditor. Once the programs have finished in 2018, once the enhanced surveillance provided by the Commission and the Eurogroup countries will be concluded, the ESM will remain there because the maturity of the loans transferred to Greece is extremely long, goes till the 60s or the 70s of this century, and the ESM needs to have in mind the degree of long-term sustainability of the achievements of the program, and from this point of view still remain potential challenges, some of them of social nature, but other of economic nature or institutional nature. So this long-term view is one of the clear challenges for the exercise that we are trying to evaluate. Next, please. Implications for the Greek economy's resilience to shocks. Of course, the situation has clearly improved during the program years, but in our analysis during the report, financial sector shock absorbing capacity remains weak. And this now, these days of the pandemic, we are looking at some serious problems in one of the big Greek banks, the Piraeus Bank. And another point of resilience, another point of attention to assess the resilience to shocks are that, in our view, the program strategies challenge societal unit, and the lack of social cohesion, enough social cohesion, and the lack of a strong ownership, both from the part of the Greek authorities and from the part of the Greek society, remain a big challenge to assess, looking forward, what will be the resilience to shocks, the one we are suffering now, the pandemic, but other shocks that for sure in Greece and in many other countries can emerge during the next decades. Sustainability is not only about debt, but of course, debt sustainability is extremely relevant given the huge amount of loans transferred to Greece during the past years. And we pay attention in the report to the results obtained with the debt sustainability assessments. I start by the second bullet point of this slide. The ESM program was marked since 2015 till 2018 by an open disagreement on debt sustainability and debt sustainability methods of assessment and on debt sustainability results among the institutions, and in particular among the EU institutions, the European Commission, and also the ESM, and on the other hand, the IMF. And these discussions regarding the degree of achievement in terms of debt sustainability and the results and the follow-up of these results created a lot of difficulties to adopt decisions in due course during, in particular, the ESM program since 2015 till 2018. We need, as we will see in the recommendations, to establish some convergence of methodologies and on ways to look at this debt sustainability. Next, please. The program risks and adaptability. Well, one of the conclusions I think is an important one is that in our view, stakeholders implicitly settled for a low growth equilibrium. What it means by this, that because of the most important target was to increase the fiscal adjustments to comply with the targets for reduction of primary deficit and so on, the reaction in Greece has been to reduce investments, public investments, not to pay enough attention to the way to attract private investments, not only internal private investments, but external foreign direct investment, and the way to achieve the targets established for the fiscal adjustment has been in the last years of the programs to reduce public investment and to adjust through current expenditure. And this means lower increases in productivity and lower potential growth through the positive effect of public investments. And on the other hand, each time since 2010, the first program, until the end, the agreed program period was too short, given that the question was not only, or must not be, only the achievement of the fiscal targets, but to develop, to implement structural reforms and to increase potential growth. And the programs of 3 years time span are not well equipped to find this equilibrium between the short-term fiscal adjustments in particular and the medium to long-term view. And the next slide, communication and cooperation. A key challenge in our view to effective cooperation was that the authorities had a volatile ownership of program reforms, and not only because of the political changes that took place in 2011, 2012, or 2015 in particular, but within governments of the same political composition, the degree of ownership had not been maintained always. And the lack of comprehensive and communication and coordinated communication of long-term reform benefits had also contributed to the overall weak program ownership in Greece. So in terms of ownership, there are messages both for the Greek authorities and the Greek political forces and social forces, but also for the interlocutors on the European side that had not well prepared a coordinated and comprehensive communication.
Joaquin,
it is extremely important.
Sorry, yeah? Sorry for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, hurry you up.
Yeah. Let me 3 minutes. Yeah. I go very quickly through the, not only through the next slide, but through the recommendations. 5 group of recommendations. Recommendation for the strategic program objectives, for the guidance of program design, for program governance for sustainability, program preparation, and post-program engagement. Go ahead with the next. These recommendations are my exclusive responsibility, by the way. The 2 first group of recommendations deal with strategic program objectives and guidance on program design. I think the future programs must define clearly strategic objectives based on long-term view. Growth is a necessary condition for the success of every program. This is obvious, but had not been obvious in the design of the previous programs and in their implementation. The program design should derive its objectives and length from an analysis of the main problems to be tackled. So this requires deeper knowledge and understanding of what are the challenges to be faced by the programs. All programs should ensure a fair distribution of efforts across society. And this, in my view, was missing, maybe not in the political declaration, but of course, in the implementation and in the sequencing of the measures adopted based on the program. The programs should establish a limited number of macro-critical conditions and not dozens, even hundreds of conditions in the last program. And programs should establish an appropriate sequencing of reforms. To put an example, the financial reforms and the debt restructuring, if is needed, should be put in the first rank and not in the medium or in the last order of priorities when implementing programs. Next slide, please. The third and the fourth conditions regarding program design and program preparation. Sustainability assessment needs a broader focus beyond debt levels. The program approval should explicitly assess exit strategy options, not only establishing a cash buffer and a post-program incentive structure once the resources from the program will not be sent anymore, and building and improving a beneficiary country's institutional and administrative capacities requires understanding and cooperation between institutions. And the way we have been able from the EU side to support the administrative and institutional capacity needs to be improved, of course. Last group of recommendations, post-program engagement. A strong and coherent framework for post-program monitoring is needed, and not, I am not thinking only in the traditional surveillance, but also in advocacy, explaining, trying to convince, trying to argue to the authorities and what kind of reforms must continue to be developed after the end of the program. This required for the ESM, at least, the strengthened relations with the authorities of the beneficiary country, as well with political forces and civil society. I was impressed by the not very intense contacts with the other political forces, apart from the ones who were in government at any point in time, and with the civil society. This needs to be reinforced. And of course, the ESM and the EU in general should develop capacities to be aware of the interconnections and potential negative spillovers with the other Euro area countries. And my last slide is the year after. We can discuss this. I will not stop a minute here. Of course, the situation again is very difficult, not only in Greece, but also in Greece, with recession and imbalances. We need to think what are the incentives to continue reforms in labor and product markets now in this very difficult situation, but we will have at the same time substantial resources coming from instruments such as the EU SURE for the employment policies and Next Generation EU for resilience and digital transition and Green Deal at the European level. But we also cannot forget the problems of absorption capacity, not only of the resources that will be transferred from the EU to the member states, but absorption capacity in terms of administrative and institutional skills. There are positive elements, declining cost of finance, a lot of changes from this point of view, indeed, very positive, but the efforts to buttress implementation capacity, attention to privatization, private investment has improved in Greece, but challenges remained: fiscal space, persistent unemployment, resolution of asset quality issues in the financial sector, and public administration and social safety net reforms that needs to continue. So these are my last words. Sorry for the time, but I have a lot of things to be communicated before our debate and before listening to Miranda, for sure. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Joaquin. That was a very concise summary of the report, and the overall assessment was it's positive. But what I found in the report also is the buts, and the buts are really relevant. And I think one can draw lessons from the buts. So the Greek economy is not doing that well at all compared to its OECD competitors. It has been really losing massive in terms of GDP per capita. It won't be back to its 27 level, possibly in the early 20s only. Now with the pandemic environment, that's even more problematic. But I found really honest that you had in this report the buts, which will lead over to what one could do in terms of policy instruments to deal with it. Miranda, may I ask you to come in?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We do.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to comment on Joaquin's comprehensive evaluation of the ESM's financial assistance to Greece, which helps promote the institution's learning culture. I have prepared a really short presentation that I will bring to my screen right now. Okay. So as Joaquin said, the Greek program that was funded by the ESM gave priority to fiscal adjustment over growth-oriented structural reforms, but it takes two to tango. So if I can remind you of the sequence of events, the ESM program that was agreed in August 2015 was not just a continuation of the previous program, which had gone off track the year before, because the starting point was far worse. The newly elected government's confrontation with creditors plunged the economy back into recession, confidence was undermined, market access was lost, depositors were running for the hills, until capital controls were imposed finally in June 2015. Faced with the prospect of Grexit, the radical left government agreed to program conditionality that was neoliberal anathema to its Marxist perspective. But as the MOU that was signed in August 2015 stated, success requires ownership of the reform agenda by the Greek authorities. And this key ingredient was missing. So as Joaquin just mentioned, the growth-oriented reforms languished, and a critical mass of reforms that could have raised potential output was not implemented. Examples include privatization, product market reforms, reform of the public sector and the judicial system, improvements in the business climate, and also the private sector debt overhang was not resolved. It is being resolved now by the current government. As a result of the above, Greece's competitiveness rankings deteriorated and growth remained weak. So the conclusion of this, my first point, is that lack of program ownership really undermined the success of the program. Here you can see the World Bank's rankings of Greece's competitiveness over time. There was a big increase, a big improvement in Greece's ranking in 2014 when the procedures for starting a business were simplified. But then the ranking again went downhill. And by 2019, we were back to where we were in 2013, or even a little bit below in terms of competitiveness ranking. Actually, I should mention here that Greece's ranking is dismal in two areas. One, in enforcing contracts because of the slow-moving Greek judicial system. And second, in registering property. The system has yet to enter the digital age. My second point is that the program overestimated, overrated the spillover risks. In Joaquin's assessment is that disbursements continued despite weak program implementation, driven by Greece's liquidity needs to avoid a disorderly default that could spill over to other euro area countries. But here it is relevant to ask, how important were these spillover effects? Did they really justify prioritizing Greece's liquidity needs over reform implementation? And my answer to this question is no, because by mid-2015, The euro area already had built firewalls to prevent contagion. First of all, the ESM was up and running since 2012 with firepower of 700 billion in lending capacity. So this was a common backstop with shared risk. Also, tighter macro surveillance was introduced and was in effect since 2012. It's the so-called six-pack. Banking union was agreed and largely implemented, with the ECB taking over supervision of euro area banks in 2014. And also the ECB had launched its bond buying programs, both QE, quantitative easing, in early 2015, and the OMT program, which is bond buying targeted at weak sovereigns that are undergoing an adjustment program. So all these firewalls existed already by August 2015 when the Greek program was negotiated. So the point here is that the deficiencies in euro area architecture and in surveillance no longer played a key role for spillover risks. The key drivers of the crisis were homegrown, and Greece's risks were idiosyncratic risks. A number of academic studies have attempted to quantify the spillovers emanating from Greece, and these studies confirm that Greek spreads had largely decoupled by the time of the third financial assistance program that was funded by the ESM. Actually, Joaquin's report contains a box, I think it's box 3.2, which reports some of the results of these research studies, one of which actually was prepared by a staff member of the ESM. So my second point, the conclusion, is that the priority given to Greece's liquidity needs over program implementation was not justified. And here you have a visual regression. It's the Greek 10-year spread over the German Bund. You can see how the spread exploded as soon as it became clear that elections would be triggered in Greece and that the radical left would win the elections. The spreads peaked at the time when the Greek government announced a referendum. But as soon as the results of the referendum were reversed and the ESM program was agreed, you can see how quickly the Greek spread tightened. But you can also see that the spread of other troubled sovereigns, countries, euro area members that had undergone an adjustment program or had some fiscal consolidation issues, their spreads hardly bulged. You know, Greek risk was viewed by the market as completely idiosyncratic. And you can see how huge the widening of the spread was in 2015 compared to the pandemic program that was launched by the ECB. That's, sorry, in March 2020, not March 2018. It was March 18 of 2020. So the point here is that the concerns that that Greece's problems might spill over to other euro area countries were overrated. The third point concerns the post-program monitoring, the so-called enhanced surveillance period, which unfortunately resulted in backtracking on a key reform. It's true that the program achieved impressive fiscal adjustment, but that adjustment was largely due to raising tax rates on a narrow base, and also by cutting discretionary spending and public investment, both of which were detrimental to growth. At the insistence of the IMF, the Greek government pre-legislated cuts in pensions and in the tax-free threshold for income tax in order to provide room for tax cuts and for essential public spending. Unfortunately, the post-program monitoring permitted backtracking from these reforms, which were cancelled before they took effect, soon after the third program ended, thus reducing the fiscal space for growth-friendly cuts in tax rates and in pension contributions, and keeping basic public services like, for example, primary health provision squeezed to unsustainable levels. In November of 2018, Commissioner Moscovici, successor to Mr. Almunia, visited Athens and stated publicly that pension cuts are not needed to meet budget targets or to ensure the long-term viability of the pension system. Yet Greece remains an extreme outlier in Europe in terms of pension spending to GDP, which is heavily subsidized by taxpayers. And in any case, the pension cuts were never meant as an austerity measure, but as a means of freeing resources for the provision of essential public services that were deeply underfunded. A pension reform in 2016 cut the newly issued pensions, but left the old pensions, pre-2016 pensions, up to 40% above the new. It is these old pensions that the reform was going to cut by a maximum of 18%, but it didn't because the reform was cancelled. As a result of this, the pension system subsidizes pensioners at the expense of the working population, which is called upon to make very large pension contributions in order to collect eventually much lower pensions than those they help subsidize today. This goes against the program's stated objective to take into account the need for social justice and fairness, both across and within generations. The same applies to the tax-free threshold, which leaves more than 50% of wage earners in Greece off the hook, compared to just 8% in the euro area. So this final point is that the cancellation of these reforms was a missed opportunity to make the Greek budget more growth-friendly, more sustainable, and more fair. In closing, I would like to thank Klaus Regling and everyone who worked on the Greek program for keeping Greece in the euro area, undoubtedly the program's greatest achievement. Thank you. Sorry, we cannot hear you.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much, Miranda, for a very good and precise presentation of and discussion of Joachim's presentation. At CES, we were always wondering, when did the crisis start? In 2009, 2004? So what is the right point to think about when things turned out negatively? If you just look at the data in terms of real effective exchange rate, that's long before. And what is also fascinating to see that there was a strong real wage cut happening since 2011, but prices didn't move. So real exchange rate took a very long time to recover. And that was a crucial point in our discussions. Now going back in wearing a different hat as a previous central banker, Greece was always on a very different scale. So you wouldn't put the spreads of Italy, Portugal, and so forth on the same scale if you would look at them. But there was, of course, in terms of difference, a correlation across those fragile markets. As soon as something happens in these markets, you see it immediately in CDS spreads, in bank funding costs, and so forth. So lots of open issues, I would suppose. I don't leave it on the panel now. I just go over to, because we have a couple of Q&As, and then you'll come in. there's a number of questions from Arne Schildberg, which I tried to summarize. His questions are mainly about the macroeconomic impact of the objective to achieve, to quote him, too high primary surpluses and its consequences for growth capacity. So maybe you could come in on the issue of was this program too ambitious in terms of public sector budget adjustment, not enough time? Joaquin.
Well, in my view, we can look at this important issue first in the short term, in the 2010, at the beginning, with the first program, with the explosion of the public debt crisis in Greece, and months after in other Euro area countries. At that time in Greece, fiscal adjustment was absolutely needed, and not a gradual and a slow fiscal adjustment over 7 years. Fiscal adjustment was needed in 2010 in the very short period of time, because the market access has been lost by Greece, and the economic and monetary union, the Euro area, was not equipped with the institutions and instruments that afterwards had been built, as Miranda also said, that has improved a little bit the capacity to act of the economic and monetary union, and has diminished seriously the negative spillovers to other members of the Euro area. Mm-hmm. But in the medium to long term vision, it's obvious that the negative trade-off, if you look at the very ambitious fiscal target to have a primary surplus of your budget of 3.5% in 2017 or 2018, had negative impacts on the possibilities for structural reforms to produce the positive effects to increase potential output, had negative effects in the health, in the situation of the banking system, that had built a very, very high percentage of non-performing loans, had a negative impact in the consumption demand because of the very high levels of unemployment. And by the way, and one comment to Miranda's analysis, who I fully shared, but one comment, the question of pensions in Greece, part of the demand of good pensions is, of course, for the security and for the welfare of the retirees. But also, you need to take it, or we need to take into account that given the huge amount of job losses, the crisis in the labor market, very high unemployment, had an impact to increase resistances to pension reforms, because pensions were a kind of alternative of a very good unemployment system, a very good system of active labor market policies, and the setup of the minimum income guarantee that was introduced only during the third program in the ESM program. So it's true that the short-term fiscal adjustment needs were obvious, but over the years, this trade-off between fiscal adjustments, or further fiscal adjustments, ambitious fiscal adjustments, and the other elements to create conditions for an inclusive growth and sustainable growth need to be taken into account, in my view.
I think the political economics is very strongly in your favor, but I do recall a meeting of G7 economists in early 2010, where there was a debate about the multiplier, the famous multiplier. Mm-hmm. And later on, this publication by Olivier Blanchard and his co-author. Mm-hmm. So the economists at that time were convinced that it would be fiendishly difficult not to create a massive depression-like fallout of the of output. And the basic question then is, can you somehow accommodate that? Miranda.
The multiplier is not a constant that remains constant no matter what.
You're right.
By 2011, the program had gone completely off track. Confidence was lost. There was a huge credit crunch. Bank deposits were being depleted very rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, in these conditions, you cannot expect growth to hold up well. So I don't think the problem was the multiplier per se. It was the ability and the willingness of the Greek authorities to deliver on the reforms.
I now just pose two questions from CES friends. Sebastian Royo. Sebastian asks, thanking Joaquin and Miranda, how do you develop administrative and institutional capacities to ensure absorption capacity? Who should do that?
Well, this is a very important issue, because in our experience at the EU level, we can have leverage and instruments to help improving institutional capacities and administrative capacities with candidate countries. But once a country becomes a member of the EU was not equipped to provide this kind of support. There were some initiatives at the beginning in 2010 to find member states of the EU who could help the Greek authorities to design the institutional reforms and to improve the quality of the public administration. But only years after, the European Commission started to create their own division, their own unit to help in a more institutional way the institutional and administrative modernization. This is enough? I don't think so. The EU had also asked the cooperation with the OECD, even the World Bank for some aspects. In some cases, some particular member state had provided a very good advice and help. But I think this is a very important issue to think about where the EU Commission can find good interlocutors for this institutional building activity, or if the EU wants to create its own capacities, we will need time. This cannot be invented in a few months. And sometimes the external advice has been very useful, but in other cases, according to the interviewees that I had the opportunity to meet in Athens or elsewhere, the external advice does not have the real knowledge of the real situation, of the real challenges of a country such as Greece. In my view, it's a very important issue. When I talk about advocacy in the recommendations, I am thinking, among other things, in this kind of activities that will not require a program, an active program, open program, but will require a very continuous efforts over the years for countries, Greece, but not only Greece, in other countries also, that will not have the best internal know-how to really improve their administrative and institutional capacities in the time is needed to avoid future problems.
It's also about, you're perfectly right, it's also about ownership. If there's too much micromanagement from central institution, very difficult to implement. I now give basically the floor to Athanasios Orphanidis. Athanasios says, Mr. Almunia identifies loss of market access as the problem, but this was mainly driven by the ECB when declaring Greek debt non-eligible collateral and later imposing capital controls. Shouldn't that be part of the analysis? Are there lessons from that for the interaction between ECB and ESM programs?
Yes, I have discussed this point, among others, with my good friend Athanasios, as I had discussed in the past about Greece and other challenges with my good friend Sebastian, that was the previous person. So what happened in February 2010 or in April, March, or May 2010? At that time, the real obstacle for the loss of market access was not a particular decision of the ECB. I think it was the very, very strong negative reaction of markets, the lack of confidence of markets once the size of the public imbalances in the public sector in Greece, the fiscal deficit, the evolution of the public debt has exploded, because during the previous year, in particular in 2009, but also in the previous years, that afterwards had been discussed at length, the size of those imbalances and the trends of the evolution of those imbalances were not clearly explicited in the statistical system in Greece and in the political attitudes of the public authorities in Greece. And this reaction I remember well. These were my last days as a Commissioner for Economic and Monetary Affairs. The reaction was terrible. I cannot blame the ECB at that time. I had my own opinions on how the ECB dealt with those problems years after. And I can share some of the analysis that Athanasios has written down in very interesting articles, but in 2010, at the beginning, this was not the case.
Miranda, would you like to add?
Well, first, for the capital controls, I think there was no way out of that. If you look at the chart of Greek bank deposits, they started declining, well, of course, in the first program, but coming to the third program, they started declining already in September 2014. That was the local peak, when it became clear that presidential elections would fail to come up with a new president, and that national elections would be triggered as a result. After that, deposits declined by, if I remember the numbers well, more than 30 billion between September 2014 and June 2015, when the capital controls were imposed. I mean, in the absence of capital controls, when there is a referendum announced by the government, which markets interpreted as a vote on whether Greece would stay in the euro area or not, I mean, you can imagine the risk of Brexit that this triggered. And that's why I said in my short presentation, the depositors were running for the hills. Without the capital controls, banks would have collapsed, very simply.
We still have a number of interesting questions open. That's possibly the opportunity to have another event like this, which must go beyond Greece, because the European Stability Mechanism now is an established institution. It will be involved in crisis going forward. It might be even involved in crisis not too far away in the environment which we currently see. Greek banks were exposed largely to an economy. Banks are always bets on their local economy, so they in a way are always on the receiving end. And what one ultimately would like to think about is the structure of the economy. For example, in the case of Greece, highly tourism dependent. Can one create an environment which makes it attractive for locals to stay, not to run for the hills? Can one make it attractive for foreign investors to go into Greece. That's why the indicators Miranda showed in terms of ease of doing business, while they have many flaws, by the way, but nonetheless are important. And what could be a competitive or comparative advantage? Comparative is the better word, which would make Greece, the Greek economy, a viable proposition, which it doesn't seem to be currently if you look at the numbers. Sorry for concluding on a little bit of a sober note, but very grateful for the two of you for having joined us. And I really hope that we meet next time in person, lower level conference hall downstairs, and have a drink afterwards. Stay safe and thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Hans Helmut. Thank you very much, Miranda. And thank you very much to the staff and the management of the Center for European Studies. That is always a fantastic place to visit and to learn and to discuss and to enjoy this fantastic environment. Let's hope that the next time all of us will be there.
See you soon.